My topic is about British beer. And so I thought I'd start the talk by, of course, introducing this stuff, which, of course, is grain. So any fool, of course, can eat grain, but for which the Lord intended a more noble purpose than consumption. So let us give thanks to our Maker and glory to his bounty by learning about beer. Well, so said Friar Tuck in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and so it must be true. So yes, great though grain is for making bread, that's actually not what I do with it. I've been making beer for over 25 years. And I just got fed up of people asking me, can I buy your beer? To which, as a home brewer, I would, of course, say, no, you can't buy my beer. Eventually I gave up and turned commercial. So if you want to hear more about that story and that journey, then join me on Thursday at 7 o'clock. I'm going to talk about British beer styles. I want to start really, I think, by talking about what is beer. Obviously, in terms of what is beer, people have different thoughts about what is beer. So I'm going to give you my definition of what beer is. I've stolen this, but nonetheless, I think it's excellent to think of beer in three different categories. Those categories are ales, lagers, and lambics. And I remember that by the acronym ALL. So all beer is ales, lambics, and lagers. Why do I classify them into these three categories? It's to do with the way in which they're brewed, the yeast which is used. So when we talk about ales, we are talking about beer which is brewed with a yeast which is called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Lovely Latin name for the Latin scholars among you, of course. What it really means is it's the saccharose part of it is sugars. The myces is a fungus, and the cerevisiae is of beer. So it is literally a sugar fungus of beer. That's what it is. That's what we use to make British beer styles. It's a top fermenting yeast, that is to say it works. It actually works throughout the beer, but you actually get the head on the top of the beer when it's fermenting. And that's a very traditional British beer style, and it's fermented at around 20 degrees. A lager, radically different product. It's made with a different yeast. It's made with, again, it's a Saccharomyces because it's a sugar fungus. It feeds on sugar. But it's called Pasteuranus, named after, of course, Louis Pasteur, and it was in fact isolated and originally used by the Carlsberg Brewery. So sometimes it's referred to as Saccharomyces carlsbergensis, but Pasteuranus, or as I like to refer to it as Pasteuranus, because if you drink a lot of lager, that's pretty much what you're going to get. So I have my little ways of remembering these different things. The last one, the Lambics. The Lambics beer, we're not really great drinkers of Lambics in this country, but those of you that visit Belgium, fans of the Belgium styles, particularly around Flanders, that type of area, the yeast that they're using is a wild yeast. So they ferment, traditionally anyway, they ferment the beers in tanks which are at the top of towers. The wind blows the wild yeasts across the beer, and they effectively get infected with a wild yeast, which is generically a Brettanomyces. So it's a Breton yeast, and basically it's just a wild airborne yeast, which actually then spontaneously ferments the beer, and you get these tart flavors in the beer. And that tartness then is usually offset by fruit flavors. But I'm not going to be talking about Belgian beer. There are plenty of people who know Belgian beer far better than me. So I'm focusing in tonight on British beer styles. As we work through them, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the beers and the sort of traditional characteristics of those beers as we go. If you've got any questions, do just post them into the Q&A, and either Jonathan will interrupt me with a question when I pause for breath, or we'll try and allow a bit of time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. So with that, I'm going to start off on our journey through British beer by taking a look at brown beer. And I'm starting with brown beer because I'm going to start chronologically. So when we look at the way in which beer is made traditionally out of three main ingredients. The first of those, of course, is malted barley. Malted barley comes in lots of different colors depending on how it is kilned or cooked. So barley, when it's grown in the fields, is then taken into traditionally oast houses, and what you want to do is you want to begin germination to unlock the sugars in the grain, otherwise they're all locked up, so you're trying to release those to make them accessible to digest. And what we're doing is we start the germination process by putting them into, you wet them so they're nice and moist, you warm them up, and the way in which they were traditionally warmed up would be, you've got to heat the building by some means to begin germination, so some gentle heating. And then basically you allow, once germination has started and the little shoots begin to appear, then they are now malted, and you need to stop that process, because what you don't want is the darn things to sprout out. We're not trying to grow the stuff, we're just trying to unlock the sugars which are designed to feed the shoots. So to stop it, you then actually increase that heat and you kiln them, and that basically stops the germination process. And so, initially, if you stop the germination process and don't do it for long, you end up with a pale coloured malt, which is this. It's a pale malt. So it's gently kilned, and that actually is the basis of our British beer, is this pale malt. So all of the beers that you drink, including things like Guinness, all have predominantly pale malt in them. So typically something like Maris Otter in this area is used. That's what this is. It's a Maris Otter pale malt. And what that does, if you don't add any other grains to it, but use something which is pure pale malt, you tend to get something which is fairly pale in colour. So just to give you an example here, here's an example of a beer. This one actually is a wheat beer, which is not a traditional British beer, but is beautiful on a day like this. It's one that we brew. This is made 50% from a pale malt and 50% from wheat. But the colour, as you can kind of see from this, is very typical of the type of malt and the colours you'll get in British pale ales. More of that later. Why am I bothering to tell you all of this? Well, it's quite important if you're going to understand brown beer, because if you continue to kiln malt, you get this. This is basically crystal malt. And normally when I'm doing these types of talks in person, I hand them round and I ask people to eat it, to taste the different flavours. It's lovely to eat. It's a bit like eating Weetabix, but this is slightly darker in colour because it's been kilned longer. That's crystal malt. Typically, when you're making a British bitter and darker beers, you'll add a bit of crystal malt in there. But again, the base is predominantly pale malt. The last malt that I'm going to show you is this one. This is a black malt, really dark. Most of us associate this type of colour with a Guinness, but also you should recognise some of that colour from dark milds. But that basically is a black malt, quite bitter in flavour, so it's effectively been burnt and you get some of the bitterness in it. And so the different colour malts will give you different types of beers, and you combine the different malts to give you different styles of beers. Why is this important for brown beers? It's because if you try and get a brown beer today in the UK, you will not find anything which comes close to the original brown beers. The original brown beers were brown, not out of a particular design, but because when you kilned malt, what you would end up with is you could only originally kiln it over wood. There was no coke or coal available, so there was no smokeless fuel. The net result is a bit like our smoked fish. You get that colour going into the malt, and so that colour then, when you actually wet the malt in hot water to make your wort, which is the starting process for beer, the colours will leach out and you will get a brown smoky colour. The colour will be brown, the flavour will be smoked, and so actually what you get in the original brown beers, which was something more akin to a Rauch beer, a German Rauch beer. So if you've ever tasted the Rauch beers, some people love them, I really enjoy them, some people hate them. So it's a bit like drinking a German sausage. It has that really rich, smoky, meaty flavour. That's the original beers, and the original beers would have been really quite strong. All the evidence points to beers of the time being, 8, 10, 12%. They were really quite strong beers. So really quite strong beers, which is why I say that Robin, of course, must have had merry men, because if they were drinking beers at that strength, there was little chance they were anything else. So the original brown beer then was made from these malts, and all of our beers would have been brown, and they all would have had these smoky flavors, because there was nothing else you could do about it. There was no other way of kilning malt. Move forward from our early beers into the Industrial Revolution, and we start moving off into this territory where it was then possible to actually get something which was this color, a nice pale malt, because coke or coal suddenly became available. People then started using it in industry. It became available, and therefore the maltsters began to say, actually, do you know what? We can use this new smokeless fuel in order to actually kiln our malt to stop the germination. And what you got, because it was smokeless, was a really pure tasting malt. None of these smoky flavors. I could have something that was really clean, which kind of leads me on to the pale ales. Because when we drink a pale ale, and I've probably got an example. This is an example of a pale ale here. So this is one that we brew here. This is example of befuddled. This is a pale ale. So again, those colours are very pale. It's slightly darker than the wheat beer. So you can kind of see the differences between something which is purely made from a pale malt and wheat to something which has actually been made. In this case, it's made from pale malt. This one actually has a little bit of black malt in it, but also crystal malt would do the same thing and give this type of color to it. So pale ales and bitters all have this sort of coloring to them. When they get more orangey, more golden in color, more caramelly, there's just higher proportions of caramel malt that go into bitters. So in this country, we're typically referring to to bitters and pale ales, and they're pretty much used interchangeably. Don't confuse pale ale with IPA. So pale ale is literally just a pale ale, and we now know what an ale is. If we use the definition, ale is traditional British beer made from a top fermenting yeast. So that's a pale ale, nice and pale in color. They had a really clean flavor to them. So none of the smokiness. The problem is that when they originally introduced this pale malt, cooking your malt over wood was cheap. Wood was plentiful. It was a nice cheap fuel, but coke and coal were expensive. So originally they were very expensive. Demand was high for them for industry. And so the problem is that yes, you got this beautiful clean flavor to your beer, none of this brown tinge and smoky flavors, but it was expensive. And because it was expensive, it's not what the working man was going to be able to afford to drink. So ultimately, you've got to now look for a market. So yes, of course, the wealthy can drink these expensive beers. The problem, of course, is the wealthy in this country would have been probably drinking wine. They've been drinking their French wine, not drinking beer. Beer's more of the working man's drink. So you've got to find a market for your beer. And so basically, that's where we introduce IPA. So when we get to IPA is India Pale Ale. So yes, it's pale in color. Okay, so you've got this nice pale ale, but essentially you've got to find a market for it, and your market is, well, where are these wealthy people? Where's the wealth coming from? Well, in the 17th century, it's coming from trading. You've got a spice trade, you've got the Industrial Revolution. And so basically, you've got a lot of wealthy people that are trading. You've got the East India Company, of course, that's set up. You've got a lot of people that are venturing out to India, setting up trading. And so you've got ships which are going out empty to India, coming back laden with spices. Okay, unloading the spices, sailing back to India empty, other than a few commodities that were being taken out to India. So essentially, transporting the beer from England across to India would have been relatively cheap to do. The ships are going out empty, and frankly, they need ballast in them. You need something heavy. So basically, what are we going to put in there? Well, hey, guess what? We could actually put beer in there. The problem with transporting beer is it's a pretty long voyage. There's no canal to go through that can actually take us, no Suez Canal to go through. They've got to go down through, past the Horn of Africa, right the way around you go and up. And so you've got this long journey to do. How am I going to keep my beer? Okay, well, yeah, as long as I keep the air out, it's going to keep reasonably well. But the problem is you've got this long voyage out there. And so the way to keep the beer, there are two things which help keep beer. The first is the high alcohol content. The higher the alcohol content, the longer the beer keeps. So winter beers and barley wines that we'll talk about at the end, those can keep a long time. I've successfully kept our winter beers for over 2 years and drunk them, and they're still absolutely lovely. As long as you keep the air out, they keep and they age and develop flavors and get smoother and so on. So high alcohol content beers, great for transport. The other great thing is hops. So hops give you an antibacterial property. So when you actually put hops into a beer, the hop oils come out. The hop oils, help preserve the beer. And so if you're really going to preserve your beer for a long journey, you one, keep the air out. Two, you basically make it strong in alcohol. Three, you add lots of hops. And lots of hops as a byproduct gives you a product which is really quite bitter. But hey, do you know what? I can now get my product out to India. It's a beautiful, clean tasting product, maybe with some citrus flavors in it. Ideal for a hot climate. It's rather expensive, but you know what? That's not a problem because I've got a wealthy clientele over in India. And that's how we get IPA, India Pale Ale. So it's an expensive beer, strong in alcohol, really quite bitter. And that's why I distinguish it between an IPA and a pale ale. Is a pale ale isn't necessarily particularly bitter. It may have the same color as an IPA, but an IPA should be high in alcohol, typically in excess of 5%, and a bitterness really up towards at least 50 IBUs. That's a classic IPA. So when you're out there and you're drinking Greek King IPA, it's not really IPA at all. It really doesn't have the bitterness that you'd expect from an IPA, and it certainly doesn't have the alcoholic strength. It's not really an IPA. At the end of the day, it's just a pale ale, and it's kind of just like a bitter. So basically a pause. Have you got any questions, Jonathan? Looks quiet.
Yeah, there's no questions come up at the moment, but if that's a good time for a pause, just
yeah, I'll happily take any questions while I sup.
Yeah. You have a quick sip, and is there anybody would anybody like to ask any questions about that? I mean, it's fascinating so far, I have to say. It's oh, here we go. We've got a question from Ali saying, "What are IBUs?"
IBUs, good question, Ali. International bitterness units. So there are EBUs and IBUs, European bittering units and international bittering units. And basically you just plug in a number of parameters, the quantity of hops, how long the hops are boiled for, what the alpha acids are in your hops. So when you buy hops, the alpha acids are the bitterness that come from the hops. And you plug it into a nice formula and it come back and will tell you what the bitterness is you can expect from your beer. So it's just a way of standardizing and measuring bitterness. Good question.
So it's an international bitterness unit.
It is, yeah, that's IBUs, and sometimes the Europeans get on it and call them EBUs. Any other questions?
There's one occurred to me as you were talking, which is about the original brown beers, and I understand that the reason they were brown was the smoke used in the kiln in that process. Is anybody attempting to recreate those? Is there something? Is there a niche market for that?
It's funny you should say that. I'm not aware of anybody that's trying to recreate it. I'm sure somebody must be, particularly amongst the craft brewery sector. But actually, I really fancy having a go. I'd really like to be able to brew it, because every time I do these talks, You know, I give people say, okay, I can give you brown ale, I can give you Mann's brown ale, or I can give you a you know, a Newcastle brown if I must. And basically, what the color in the beer that these days in brown ales comes from caramel.
Okay.
So I mean, yeah. So it's caramel largely. So whether that comes from, you know, you can get it to a certain degree from crystal malt, but they're tending to put in caramel into that, which is a syrup, a sugar syrup.
Yeah, and the caramelization, that would be more like the black malts in a way, wouldn't it? The caramelization of flavors.
Yeah, exactly.
We've started the floodgates on questions now, Ricky.
Okay.
So one is just carrying on the IBU question. I was asking, you can achieve different IBUs using different hop types. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. So something sort of the top end of the scale, you get something like Citra. Citra has a alpha acids at sort of 12 to 14, whereas at the other end of the scale, traditional British hops will have alpha acids of you know, anywhere between say 3.5 to 5 to 6.5, somewhere around that. So a traditional British, you know, bitter, you know, is mid-range bitterness, is made from something like Fuggles and Goldings, where they're all around 4.5 to 6 alpha bitterness units. But a lot of the IPAs, particularly the American IPAs, are made from things like Citra. Now you've got to be careful because you can adjust based upon that. If I add more hops, of course, I can use a low alpha acid and add more hops to increase the bitterness. Yeah.
Right. So it's a blending process. So I think that's a very comprehensive answer to that question. And the next one you've just touched on, actually, because you mentioned the American IPAs and the UK IPAs. The question here is saying that they taste different. What's the difference in the way they're brewed?
Yeah, with the American IPAs, two things, of course, is of course they use what hops are available locally, and the flavors that come from those hops differ. So the American IPAs tend to have a lot of citrus flavors to them, whereas the British IPAs tend to have sort of more grass and floral notes to them, are much more subtle. Also, the American IPAs, there's a kind of a difference between an East Coast IPA and a West Coast IPA. So the East Coast IPAs are kind of like a halfway house where they're taking British pale, you know, the British pale malts, and then they're brewing it with locally brewed hops, such as Citra, which is actually very similar to our Margaret's Field. That's what we do. We call it an American East Coast IPA. So it has, you know, really citrusy, orange and grapefruit notes to it. Reasonably bitter. If you then begin to go over to the West Coast, they start adding wheat and oats. And what that does is give it, one, it's cloudy, like a wheat beer. It also makes it much more creamy. So if you think of the American double IPAs, which is really pushing the style, a double IPA will be completely cloudy, will be 7, 8, 9% in alcohol content, really full of grapefruit, really creamy, almost, it's almost, you can think of it like I'm eating porridge, you know? Yeah. Absolutely wonderful chilled on a hot day.
Okay, thank you. Well, that was a question from Hideki, thank you. And we've got one more for this stage. I think it's from Simon Gibson. It's like, are there alpha and beta hops? And if there are, what's the difference?
Don't think there's alpha and beta hops. You may be getting confused between alpha amylase and beta amylase. Which is to do with the reactions that go in when we're actually mashing. Mashing is the process. Think of mashing like making a cup of tea, except instead of putting tea into hot water, you actually mix hot water and malted barley, which is mashing. And that basically releases both alpha amylase and beta amylase, which digests the long starch chains in the beer, which breaks it up into its different molecules. So you get glucose, which is the single chains, and then it basically breaks it down up into maltose and trimaltose and dextrose and so on. So yeah.
So that's all down the sugar line, and I've got a sort of supplementary question linked to that. What about alpha and beta acids in hops? Is that something different?
Yeah. So again, I'm not an expert on hops. And so, you know, we tend to talk about alpha acids. We don't tend to, at least I haven't come across beta acids. So if somebody knows the answer, they can enlighten me.
Oh, right. We'll feedback that one to Bert to investigate while we carry on with the talk. So I think
no problem.
Do post more questions as we go, but I think we better let Ricky carry on with the next part of his talk.
Yeah, no problem. So we began to talk about pale ales, and I said, look, there's a lot of similarity between pale ales and bitters. But you probably heard the term, you walk into the pub and they say, hi, landlord, I'll have a pint of best. What do they mean by best? In fact, what do they mean by landlord? Let's start with landlord. Why is a landlord called a landlord? The answer is that a lot of pubs would have been owned by the owner of the local land. And so basically the pub was on the land owned by the local gentry, and hence the owner of the pub was literally the lord of the land, or the landlord. And so hence the person that owns a pub would be called the landlord, as opposed to the publican. But that's really the difference. That's why we call them a landlord. That's what they were. Best. Well, when you look at bitter, there's ordinary, best, special, and even extra special, or ESP, extra special pale, or ESB, extra special bitter. What's the difference? Well, the answer is it's a way of distinguishing between different qualities of the same beer originally. So when you make beer, there's lots of different ways you can do the mashing process. But originally, when they used to mash beer, what you'd get is you basically put the grain into an insulated vessel, you fill it with water, you get a temperature of between 65 and 67 degrees centigrade. You leave it to sit there for about an hour, and then you run off the liquid. Now, originally, what they can do is they would run off the liquid. That's your first running off. That's full of sugars. And basically, that will give you a high alcohol, full of flavor, really malty beer. That's your special beer. That's the top grade of beer. That goes into a barrel on its own. That's an expensive beer. You then fill the vessel again, because there's still sugars in the vessel. Fill the vessel again, leave it, run it off. You get your second run off. So then you get your next grade of beer, and that basically can give you your special. And then you do it again, you can have a best, and then you do it again, and you get your ordinary. And you don't really want to do it again, because eventually you get water and you get really harsh tannin flavors, and nobody wants that. That then gives you 3 or 4 different grades of beer. And what would happen is in the pub, those would sit behind the bar. And depending upon your wealth, you would go into the bar, and you would say, basically you'd put your money on the table, and the landlord would have different grades of beer chalked up on the board, and he would mix it behind the bar. So depending on, the poor people would, would put their money down. They would have the stuff that came straight out that 4th runoff. It's a quaffing beer. Okay, it's really light, doesn't have much flavor, quite watery. But then he could then take any of the other grades, or he could blend any other grades to suit somebody's pocket. And that's essentially where we got all of these different grades of bitter, your ordinary, your best, your special, your extra special. Only what happens now, of course, is that's done in the brewery. And so we basically go ahead and we can either brew a high gravity, really malty, rich beer that uses a lot of malt. That's the top end, that's your extra special. Down to something where we deliberately brew it at a lower strength. We either use less malt or we use more water, and it gives you something which is more of a quaffing beer. And I think somebody just answered the question about alpha acids and beta acids, but perhaps we'll come back to that one at the end. Okay, so that deals with, we've done browns, we've talked about pale ales, we've talked about IPA, haven't really talked about mild, and I really should from a chronological perspective, because of course mild had its heyday really in the 50s. Everybody, the working man, drank mild. So what was mild, and why has it gone out of fashion? Mild was, as its name suggests, a mild beer. It was not bitter, okay? And most of the flavor, therefore, in a mild beer comes from the malt. There's not much in the way of hops that have gone into it. And so you would use things like your crystal malt and chocolate malt and black malts in order to give it all of the flavor. And so when you get something that's mild, mild literally means not bitter. So if you don't like a bitter beer, have a go at drinking a mild. You'll probably quite enjoy it. And if you like chocolate flavors and roasted barley and those really rich notes, go on, give mild a try. It's a shame, really, that it's dying out. Really, really nice. And the great thing about mild as well is a lot of milds were brewed to be light in alcohol, you know, under 3%. And let's face it, low alcohol beers are making a bit of a comeback. So you know, I think there's a great market there to reintroduce the style as a, you know, branded as a low alcohol beer, which I think would be great. You know? But they were designed so when you come up out of the mines, you know, you come off the labouring all day. What did you do? Well, you went home. You might have had your tea, or you went straight into the pub. And basically you quaffed down 4 or 5 pints, then you went home, had your cup of tea, come back out again, quaff another 4 or 5 pints and get up to work the following day. I mean, it's a win-win. So absolutely wonderful. That's what was being drunk. So it was a light in alcohol, full of flavour, not particularly bitter, a beer for quaffing, and they were milds. And there were kind of 2 different styles. There's a dark mild and a light mild. I was looking at Timothy Taylor. They do some great beers, but what I really like about them is they actually do a dark mild and a light mild. How rare is that? I thought that was great. So again, you know, if you don't like if you're not a real IPA fan, if you don't like those real bitter notes, go and give a light mild a try if you want something that's light in you know, color, that's sort of refreshing, not too heavy on the alcohol, and you know, not too bitter. Then a light mild, and it's just down to the amount of dark malt you add versus pale malt as to sort of the colors and the flavors that you get. So mild was very popular in the Midlands. I think, you know, obviously mainly in the Midlands was the last bastion of coal mining, tended to be in that region really. You know, between the Midlands and Manchester, that type of area, a lot of coal mining, and I guess slightly further north. So that's the reason why milds are very popular, and really why those were the sort of the last areas where mild was popular. But yeah, I think it's a greatly underrated drink, and I keep coming back to mild and thinking, why don't we drink more of this? So there's my plug for mild. That said, I don't yet brew one, but hey, it's coming. It's coming. I'm going to brew one, even if it's just for me and a few diehard fans. We'll get some mild. So I've talked about mild and brown and bitters and pale ale. I've told the story of IPA. Let's talk about some of the others then. Let's talk about porters and stouts and barley wine. So porter. Porter's a really interesting drink, yes. A lot of legend, I think, about, you know, what is porter and, you know, how did it get its name? So let's start off with the easy one, which is really, what is porter? So porter as a drink, it's a dark beer, and it tends to have acetic flavors in it. Now you might be thinking, acetic flavors, that's horrible, that's beer when it's gone off. And that's kind of true, actually. You know, when beer oxidizes, you start getting acetic acid, and basically that can actually taint the beer and give you some, you know, some really, you know, it slowly becomes more like drinking sort of a rancid apple juice, really, is how it eventually becomes. You can smell it the moment you put your nose anywhere near it, and boy, can you taste it when it's really gone. So when you begin to taste that sort of, you know, those acetic flavors, I think the first thing to say is, am I drinking a porter? Because if you are, that's a desirable character in a porter. Now, originally, the only way you could get these acetic flavors was the same as the only way you could make vinegar, is you basically had to take a product and age it. There was no other way, which of course made porter quite expensive anyway. So again, you've got to find your market. The other thing about dark beers, you know, where a dark beer's drunk, where a light beer's drunk, is actually due to, you've got to go back to, why are people drinking the sort of drinks that they are? And it's down to climate and water. So let's start off with climate. If you go down to the Mediterranean and further south, where you get nice hot summers, what do you grow? You grow grapes. It's not great for growing grain, okay, because the climate's too hot. So they're going to grow a lot of beautiful fruits. You get lots of grapes. So what do? You make wine. Why not? As you come further north and the climate gets colder, you get into much more temperate climates. It isn't so good for grapes. So as you come up through France, you go out of the grape growing regions, you get into northern France, and hey, guess what? In northern France, yes, you get champagne and so on, because that will grow because of the types of soil and the climate. But also you begin to get beer in northern France, Alsace and so on. So why are they beginning to grow, why are they beginning to get beer? The answer is because of what they can grow. It's easy to grow barley and wheat, and therefore that's what's available. That's what you use for a cheap, plentiful supply of something to make something to drink. And so as you start going further north, countries switch from being wine drinkers on the whole into being beer drinkers. And so basically what you drank was based upon your climate, and when you drank it was based upon the season, and it's why we get seasonal beers. When you come to the UK, of course, most of our climate, really up until recently anyway, you can grow some grapes now, particularly champagne grapes in the south of the UK, but you really can't grow much else. So basically, as you come further north, yes, it's beer time. So the other thing that dictated your beer style is the water. So depending on the water, depends upon what is ideal. Now remember, if you've got no chemistry to analyze the water, if you don't know how to adjust the water to actually add certain salts to it and balance the acidity and the pH, you can't brew any beer. The only thing, it's best for brewing certain types of beer. The reality is that soft water, which was readily available in the Midlands in Burton, was great for brewing pale ales and IPAs. And so, of course, this whole thing of pale ales being from Burton upon Trent is simply because the water there was great for brewing it. You try and brew the same thing in your London water, which is really chalky and hard, doesn't make for a great pale ale. You need soft water, but hey, it makes great dark beers. Okay. So as a brewer, when we're brewing different styles, we can actually adjust the water. We send our water off for analysis, we get it back again, and hey, if I want to brew this style of beer, I add this, this, and this, and this, and away I go. I've got an ideal composition here for actually making that particular beer style. So basically, that's essentially why you get the different beer styles, which takes me back, of course, now to London. So London is ideal for making the darker beers. Therefore, you make a dark beer, and that's what porter is. Porter is made again from, yes, the base is pale malt, but you start introducing chocolate and roast barley and black malt and more crystal malt. And so you get these really rich flavors that come from it. But the local tastes as well dictate, things come in fashion and go out of fashion. Mild was in fashion in the 50s. You go back further in London at the turn of the century, porters were in fashion. Why? Because people craved, acidic tastes like acetic acid, vinegar, difficult, expensive to produce, and therefore was highly desirable. If the landed folk, the people that can really afford it, are drinking it, that's what everybody aspires to. And the only way to get those acetic flavors into the beer was to age the beer. You want to age it quite carefully, because if it goes too far, it's horrible. So it needs quite careful control. And so you age it, and it took time to age the beer. And it was dark because that's what you could brew really well in the south of England. So it was very popular in London, where there was a lot of traders and the money to afford this expensive drink. And that's what people drank in London. So that gives you the style of porter. So you're looking for, a pleasant acetic taste to it, a dark color, lots of richness that's coming from those darker malts and caramelization in those malts. But why porter? Well, that one's difficult to separate out fact from fiction. So I'm just going to give you something that sounds plausible, which is essentially somebody has to, transport that beer. If you're brewing it in London, selling it in London, which is where your market is, basically it goes out the brewery, it trundles around the corner and into the pub, and away it goes. So somebody has to carry it. Latin scholars amongst us, okay, we started on a bit of Latin scholarship with the yeast. We can begin to wrap up with some Latin scholarship. Those of you remember your Latin, so portare, which of course is to carry. And so just maybe because the people that were transporting the beer around on sack barrows were porters, it became known as the beer that the porters brought, hence porter. Hey, it sounds plausible. It's about the best I can give you.
Yeah, I've done a very cheeky Wikipedia search, and it says here the name originated due to its popularity with street and river porters. So it's not far away. No,
exactly right.
And Wikipedia is obviously right in all cases as well. So
well, it's bound to be, has to be. Yeah. So that gives you porter. If we begin to extend porter out and we get to stouts. So what is stout? Again, the term kind of has gone out of use. You know, we might refer to somebody who was stout as being short and rotund. In beer terms, a stout beer just meant a strong beer. It's a stout drink. And so a stout literally originally just meant a strong beer. Today it's become synonymous. Strong beers tended to be drunk in the winter. What do we want in the winter? We don't want something that's light and flowery and citrusy. We want something that's dark and rich and warming, which kind of brings me on to an excuse to drink. I think this is Jonathan's favorite. This is our beer. This is called Judy's Hole. There we go. So this is Judy's Hole. It's a dark beer. Technically, this is actually not a stout. It's not really bitter enough to be a stout. And actually, I've deliberately brewed this one not to be at its winter strength. This is about 4.5%. We do a winter version, which is about 6.5%. And so it's even maltier and even richer. But frankly, you drink it in a wine goblet sitting by the fire on a cold evening, and it's absolutely wonderful. And then you get up at the end of the evening and realize why it's so wonderful. But this is a lovely, rich flavor, and the color, you can see this dark color. But again, what might surprise you is the majority of this beer is actually made from pale malt. That's the basis of the malt. What I then do, of course, is that I then add other magic ingredients. I'll tell you some of them. This one, of course, black malt. We add chocolate malt, black malt, crystal malt, and basically a few other magic ingredients to give us this lovely liquor, which is beautiful. To really make it a traditional stout, you know, our winter version has the strength to be called a stout beer. But stouts really these days are synonymous with things like Guinness. The bitterness can begin to come from the higher proportion of black malt. You know, if you burn something, when you burnt your beef burgers on the barbecue or your sausages, and you bite into that outside and it's charcoaly, it's got a bitterness to it. And basically that's the same with the black malt. So we don't use a lot of it, otherwise it just becomes a bit like drinking charcoal. But again, from a hop perspective, you know, as you begin to increase the hops, you increase the bitterness. And stouts typically, you know, like a Guinness, tends to be quite creamy, which can come from the addition of oats. So you can add some oats into there, which give it that creamy texture to it, and give it a nice head as well. Give it a bit of barley in there, a bit of roasted barley, aids head retention. Add some really nice caramel flavors to it, and that gives you the stout strength, the color, the flavor, the richness. Increase the hopping, you get a nice bitter beer. And then if you must, and you serve it with as well as CO2, a bit of nitrogen dioxide in there as well, and you mix the gases together, and then if you chill the hell out of it, you get your Guinness coming out of the extra cold Guinness tap, and you can no longer taste the darn thing. There we go. So I understand a lot of people like it. I personally find it a little bit too bitter. But it is extremely popular, and that really is what stout is. Stout just really means a strong beer, which kind of gives me to my final beer style and will allow me a bit of time for some questions, which on the British beer scale section is a barley wine. So what's a barley wine? Well, a barley wine is a really strong beer, nothing more than that. Barley wines were called wines because they were similar strengths to wines. Once you start pushing a beer up over about 9–10%, you're getting into wine type of alcohol content. There is a limit, though, to what you can do with yeast, certainly with an ale yeast. Once you push the alcohol limit up of above about 14%, what happens is you kill the yeast. The yeast doesn't like it, so it basically merrily chomps away and feeds on the sugars. The byproduct is alcohol and CO2. The alcohol finally will build up and up and up until eventually, if there's still enough sugars for it to keep feeding, then it keeps feeding and feeding until it doesn't die because it can't feed anymore and reproduce anymore. It dies because the alcohol darn well kills it. So it kills itself on its byproduct, which is the alcohol. So it dies and settles back down to the bottom of the beer, which is great because you can just get the yeast, scrape the yeast off the bottom. Or in fact, most fermenters have a conical bottom to them, which aids basically in the collection of the yeast, and then you can just run the yeast off at the bottom. And so you basically, it kills the yeast, but you get really quite a strong beer. But you've got to have a lot of richness, you've got to have a lot of malt in there to get the high sugar content, which you can either get from adding a lot of barley, or cheaper, you can start adding caramels and sugars to it. So what happens is you tend to get a lot of caramels and sugars, so you could use dextrose and so on. And glucose and candy sugar and so on, and raw unrefined sugar, in order to get that, so those caramel flavors into it. All those sugars then the yeast feeds on. Eventually it kills off the alcohol. What you get left then tends to be a sweet, syrupy, high alcohol liquid. Not my thing at all, but some people love them. Okay, so you basically, that's barley wine, so it's just a really strong beer. They're not often dark. Most of them tend to be sort of caramel in color, because they're using a lot of the pale malts and caramels and sugars and so on to try and get those sugars up. But if you treat them like a wine and drink them like a wine, they're fine. If you drink a barley wine by the pint, on your own head be it. I would find it really difficult personally to drink. But by the wine glass, and again, if fine on a winter's day in a small quantity, I think.
I did a brew of barley wine, and I used those little 1/3 pint bottles you get on a French booze cruise, and that was just right. And one of those was fine. You went more than one of those, you had trouble.
Yeah. So with that, that's kind of a lightning tour through beer styles. Normally what I do is I actually run these sessions over about 3 or 4 hours, and I start doing some of the other styles which have crept into to British craft brewing. And so I start talking about wheat beers and fruit beers and lambics, because you can find them in British beer styles now as well. And why not throw in an American East Coast and West Coast IPA to show the styles and contrast and so on. And so we'll typically drink anywhere between 14 and 20 beers, because typically what I will do is I basically, you pay for a ticket and you arrive at the event and all the beer is thrown in, and basically we raise money for charity when we do these events. And so about half of the ticket price covers the samples of beer. And so I wax lyrical about beer, and I pass around bottles of beer for you to try what I think are particularly good examples of the style. And we sit and we discuss and we chat about the beer styles. And generally the whole thing by the end of the evening is completely broken down and it becomes chaos. But they are great fun, and we usually raise a lot of money for charity doing them, having enormous fun. So as soon as we can, let's go and do one of those events, and we'll spend 3 or 4 hours drinking beer and talking beer until it completely degenerates, and have a lot of money into a pot for charity. But thank you very much. Let's just take questions on beer or brewing or anything else. What have we got?
Okay. Well, we've got a couple. Before I go to the questions, just like to thank you very much for that, Ricky. I found that fascinating. It's taught me a few things lots of things I didn't know. We've got one question which had just been asked. It's been there a little while from Hideki, and she says it might be a little bit off topic. But do you know why did cask ales develop or remain only in the UK? Is cask just a UK thing?
I don't think it's just the UK thing. I think a lot of it is to do I guess climate, and when you think about the beers that were being brewed, the type of beers that were being brewed, I said, was largely due to climate and water. And all of the British beer styles basically were, are ales, and the beers that were being brewed in Europe, whilst originally they wouldn't have been lagers. Once the different yeast was found, in continental Europe, of course, you have much hotter summers. In the much hotter summers, you want something which is cold, and lagers are made. The word lager is a German word, lagen, which basically means to age. And so, the lagers that we're often drinking today really are very, poor representatives of what is a most excellent style of beer. But to make a true lager, the yeast ferments at much lower temperatures. And and it takes a lot longer. So the fermentation process in a British beer takes anywhere 3 to 7 days. Job done, out it goes, which for fast production of beer is great.
And is that the same whether you're bottling or going into cask? Because there's another question, just was asking that question.
It depends if you're going to let it condition in the cask or condition else. If you're bottling, what I would normally do is I would put it into a conditioning tank, let it condition. That is to say, make sure the beer, the yeast drops out of suspension, the flavors get to blend and become more subtle, a bit like a wine. There are no harsh flavors. As the yeast drops out of suspension, which if you allow it to happen naturally, takes a little while, the beer then becomes clear. It continues, of course, because there's yeast in there, continues to ferment. At that point, it's in a closed vessel, so the CO2 builds up and gives it gentle conditioning, which gives you the gas in the beer. It's all natural, and so you end up with a very natural product. Now, that can be done in a cask, as well as it can in a stainless steel tank. The difference simply being, if you go straight from the fermenter into a cask, the chances are it's being rolled out, into the brewery, and basically a lot of going direct into cask and then out to the brewery is driven by commercial pressures. And so what you then need to do is start introducing processes to clear the beer faster. So yes, I can get a clear beer by adding various chemical additives, some of which, of course, if you're vegan, are not going to be acceptable. That will clear the beer faster, but does nothing for allowing the flavors to mellow and mingle and condition and improve. So with bottled beer, generally, I personally always put all of my beer into conditioning tanks, let it age for about as long as I can keep people at bay. And then basically, if I'm bottling, we will bottle from the conditioning tank. If it's going to cask, I take it out of the conditioning tank into cask.
Right. So basically the same process for both.
Yeah, and going back to the original question on, why is it mainly the UK that has cask? It's simply because most of Europe, the predominant beers in Europe are, lager styles. So they basically, are highly carbonated, need to be kept cold, kept in sealed containers. And that really doesn't lend itself, that high pressure, pressurized environment and chilled. And you want to keep that high carbonation and chilling. So you keep the air out of them. So you end up in a cask, which basically then is connected via a sealed tube to, I won't call it a pump because it's not being pumped, and basically everything is chilled and sealed off, and then you usually might well also inject CO2 into them as well, because that's what people expect. And so I think it's just market pressures. Originally, the German style lagers, the Czechoslovakian Pilsen, would have been really good quality craft beers, and so we should never, I think, cast any aspersions on lager in its true form. It's an art form, and it requires it's an expensive beer to produce, and it's why a lot of breweries in the UK don't produce true lagers. What the tendency is to brew a pale ale You brew a pale ale and then basically you force carbonate it. If you then want to have a really clear beer, because the public demander, the beer is absolutely clear, then basically the way to get it absolutely clear, if you don't want to leave it for 6 weeks, is basically to then actually add chemical additives in order to actually pull the yeast out of suspension.
So to do with shelf life and just, as you say, demands.
Yep.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you. It's the other points I've got on the screen in front of me are all actually just saying thank you very much for an enjoyable, engaging, and educational talk.
Okay, great.
And I think if you once we get past this lockdown and we're able to get together, I'm sure if you let us know next events you plan to run, I'm sure you'll get some takers from the group.
Great, no problem. And maybe we could do something at a festival sometime and have an enjoyable evening.
Oh yeah, well, hopefully we'll have a winter festival.
Indeed.
I don't know if any timing's been talked about that for yet, but that could be the opportunity.
Agreed. Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for your attendance, and stay in touch.
Thank you, Rick.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.